Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Nate Fischer, who is an investor and entrepreneur and the CEO of New Founding, a venture firm for the American right. In this conversation, we talk about his political leanings and how he sees the right having victories within the American landscape through business, through investment, and through alternative forms of entrepreneurship. Very interesting conversations out of my wheelhouse because I'm not really a business-minded man, but I found Nate Fischer very fascinating and succinct and learned a lot in this conversation. So if you want to follow him or invest with him, links to his work are down there in the description. Without further ado, here is Nate Fischer. Where are you
I'm
about?
in Dallas.
Oh, okay. Is that where you're from, or is that just where you
Nope.
were taken?
I'm from upstate New York originally. I've been here about 5 years. I see Dallas as, in many ways, a natural capital of Red America. So,
Mm.
to the extent that there is an alternative aligned economy set of institutions on the right, I think Dallas is a good place for them. And it's certainly been a space that you've seen a gravitation of people
Yeah.
and to some extent companies with this set of values.
Why do you think Dallas? Was it the business culture that kind of set it up that way, or something else?
I think it's a combination. I think it's scale. I think it's in a big, important red state. It is a very business oriented culture, which is lacking in a lot of cities. And then it's also, in some sense, you could give it a sort of cosmopolitan from within America culturally. Like you could move from almost anywhere in the country in the U.S. and feel at home fairly easily in Dallas.
Hmm. What do you mean it's oriented towards business as opposed to someplace else? Like, what does
It's the
that
kind
mean?
of place where business gets done. So people are down to do business. It's one of the probably few cities in the country where you can sit down for a lunch and a multi-million-dollar deal gets done after, like, someone will write a check for an opportunity. They're there to do business in a way. I was in Tampa. I started my career in Tampa, and Tampa is very much not a city like that. It's much more, it's much sort of sleepier culture. There's operations, there's businesses being built, but it's not really. It's not a city where deals are. It's not a culture of deal making there.
Hmm.
And I think there's a few cities, New York, L.A., Silicon Valley, all of those have a real culture of deal making. None of them are red cities in the least.
Hmm.
So
How did you get into business? What attracted you to that field?
I I I've always been drawn to business since I was a kid. I saw business as I saw business as, in some sense, sort of one outlet for broader questions about how to have leverage in the world. And I guess going to
Hmm.
how I specifically made that original turn into business, I was in college. I was studying political science. I was very interested in politics. I remember spending a summer in DC, and I became convinced, and I think it may almost have been an intentional part of the program. I became convinced that DC was the sort of place that people like careerists like Mitt Romney would climb their way to the top. It was a place that rewarded a certain game that you would play, and then any sort of non-consensus viewpoint would likely get you shunted to the side and marginalized career-wise. So I remember this was summer after my sophomore year. I remember immediately making a decision that uh, I have no interest in politics. I have no interest in a career where you have to be a conformist. Whereas investing, if you make a non-consensus but correct move, you can make a lot of money. You can be rewarded. And
Okay.
so I was drawn to investing at that point. I sort of made an immediate decision I would go into investing. I went to law school as an avenue to get there, but then ended up going straight into business after that, doing buying distressed apartment buildings in Florida and Texas in 2011. And it was really significant out of favor asset class, but we saw macro trends. We saw people moving to these red states, and I believed that it was a very attractive play. And certainly proved to be right, and bought a lot of apartments and grew that very quickly, and ended up being very, very successful in that. And it's interesting, during the Trump era, I got sort of more into politics. In a sense, my original thesis was no longer true. Now, Trump, who's an outside the box, non-consensus guy, was disrupting the space, and the Mitt Romneys were the ones being shunted to the side. And so it became clear that my original thesis about politics was no longer true, and I returned to a lot more focus on politics. But I still see a lot of the best opportunities to achieve anything in that space as happening through business rather than through sort of conventional formal politics.
Okay. So you're kind of putting a lot out there. So Charles Haywood went to law school and he tried to practice law, or he practiced law for a while, and then he ended up going to business. You said law school was, you were doing it not for law, but for business. How does that flow into it?
So it was, so I went to a college called Calvin College, which was a sort of mediocre Christian-ish liberal arts college in Grand Rapids, and not a school I've subsequently publicly denounced their trajectory on. But not a school that was going to get me into Wall Street or get me into any sort of high level of business. And I got into Harvard Law School, and so it was sort of, in a sense, in a very simple sort of basic way, just having an elite credential gives you the ability to get into a lot of circles, and I think that was a big part of the basic calculus. And then the plan was going into bankruptcy law. My thought was practice bankruptcy law for a few years, and through that go into distressed investing. Distressed investing obviously is a sort of often and almost inherently non-consensus. I guess not inherently non-consensus, but it's certainly a place where if you make the right non-consensus bet, there's a lot of opportunity. So distressed investing seemed like a natural vehicle for what I saw as what I gravitated toward and what I saw as the opportunity. So the plan was to go to a law firm, do that for a few years, learn bankruptcy law, go over to a distressed hedge fund or something like that, and then work my way up there. What I ended up doing was I ended up partnering with a classmate, not going back to a law firm, ended up turning down the law firm that I had an offer at, and going straight into distressed investing in a much less institutional way. So it's much more of a scrappy, build your own firm than get a job at an elite firm and kind of keep playing that game. Which is actually in some ways a more non-consensus move, sort of. It was actually a more fitting move for me. And I think it's a much better fit for me temperamentally to have pursued that career than to have gone to a Wall Street firm in the first place.
Yeah. Could you define distressed investing? What do you mean by distressed?
So it's it can be a very broad category. And for me, it was anything where there is, so coming out of bankruptcy law, it would be anything where the company is in financial distress. So it doesn't necessarily need to be operational distress, but it can be financial distress, which means that it's capital structure is unstable, it's over-levered, it's not able to operate in ordinary course of business, and there needs to be some sort of restructuring. So whether that's a bankruptcy and a transition of ownership from the shareholders to the bondholders, or there's sort of a set of different, in some cases, there's different tranches of debt, and there's a lot of jockeying for who's going to end up with control of something or control of the process. So that would be one. And then what we ended up doing with real estate was a lot of buying REO apartment buildings, which is assets that are already owned by the bank. So the bank has already taken the apartment building back. It's sitting on their balance sheet. It's sold as a clean sale. So it's not really complicated from a perspective of the financial structure of the transaction. But I think it broadly falls in the same category, because in that case, it's actually operationally distressed. Typically, the asset is not. It's not being run by a professional manager whose business model is running businesses like that. And so there's a lot of ability to buy something opportunistically, buy it at an attractive price if you know how to evaluate something that there's not a lot of buyers for. You can think of it as a pretty broad category in many ways. Yeah. But the narrow version would be stuff where bankruptcy law or financial restructuring is going to going to play a role. The broad one would be sort of any situation where there's financial or operational distress outside of the ordinary course of business.
So you come in, and you guys would take ownership or responsibility for an asset and then flip it in some way, or add, reorganize it in some way so that it returns to being valuable?
Yeah, so there wasn't a lot of financial reorganization. We did some where we would buy the note, we would run through a bankruptcy process or foreclosure process. We would take control of the property, but for most, we're buying the property from the bank. We're raising money, so we'll raise money from outside investors. With that equity, we then go to the bank. We bid on the asset, buy the apartment building. We built our own property management company. We had employees who did maintenance, who did the property management, all of that. Generally, there's a level of capital investment in the property, so we'll do some renovation. Often a financially distressed property has just had a lot of deferred maintenance, there's a lot of stuff that's going to be a pretty clear value add in terms of increased rents, and yet it's been deferred because the owner hasn't been able to afford it. And in some cases, there was real sort of vacancy in the market for a little while, but there's also the situation where even if the market is sort of healthy, if the owner has too big of a mortgage and too high of their cash flow needs to go to the mortgage, there's a lot of things that would be pretty obvious, easy return investments, renovating a really old kitchen, for instance, that they don't have the cash to do. And so everything has to go to debt service. And so there's a lot of easy stuff to do that you can do to improve the property, and then capture the upside as the profits increase, as you're able to increase occupancy. And we ended up holding most of the assets we sold the bulk of our early buys. So we bought between 2011 and 2014. We sold a lot of those in 2019, I think late 2018 through early 2020. And so we ended up holding for about 7 or 8 years, which is sort of normal for a private equity. We weren't buying to flip. We were buying to buy properties that we expected to become a lot more valuable. And in some ways, as the cycle continued to boom, as the Fed continued to print money, that ended up our thesis bore out maybe more than we could have anticipated as the Fed printed money and prices increased.
So, that's kind of complex. Then you're benefiting from something that you might have a moral qualm about the Fed printing money. What's your stance on that?
Absolutely. I think it was. I mean, it's certainly something that I think is questionable to undesirable for the country. So I recognize that. I think it's good. It's good for distressed investors who are correct about making a non-consensus move to come in and make a lot of money. That's a good system. It encourages behaviors that are virtuous for the system. I don't think that there's any great virtue in people who just happen to own levered assets, seeing the prices of those assets double because the Fed's printing money. And so that I see as a suboptimal one. And in a sense, we predicted one side of that. We benefited from both sides of that. So for me, it's part of the reason it's part of the reason I never felt sort of called to remain in private equity per se. Real estate private equity is a career. I didn't want to make a career of real estate where really most of your money comes in many ways. Certainly as we were doing it from gathering assets and sort of hoping the Fed continues to print money. I would much rather be betting on things whereby accelerating them, I'm doing things that I think are unquestionably good for the country.
Mm-hmm. And so politics is about, loosely speaking, politics and business share a core aspect of ordering society. It's really principled on order or ordering. So I see the crossover there. Where do you see the crossover? Because you said that you were contemplating getting into politics, but then you saw what it was all about. And so you went to business and then you returned to politics. So there's a crossover for you. And what's the values that are shared between your politics and then your business acumen or stance?
So I would say it's particularly obvious in venture. So in venture, if you think about what venture is, venture in startups, you're conceiving of something that doesn't exist and you're in a sense willing it into existence. So a new startup is, and particularly in the current generation of startups, where there's a lot of network technologies, there's a lot of social technologies, there's a lot of values-laden technologies. I think all technologies sort of have some value component, but there's ones that are particularly values-laden. So example I'll give is sort of in the 2010s, you really saw a shift to the messaging around startups became obviously political. You think of you think of Facebook's previous mission, which was to make the world a more open and connected place. Like, that's not, we're just going to make a bunch of widgets and we're going to make them cost effectively. That's a real vision of how they see the world being ordered. And it has baked in certain values. It's values of like broad connection across the globe is a good thing. It's a global, pro-globalist mission. You even can contrast that with, say, Microsoft's mission, which was, or its vision was, I think, a computer on every desk, which was, it's certainly going to change the world in important ways, but they're not focusing on the mission of reorganizing society. They're focused on, we're putting this gadget on people's desks that empowers them to use it in different ways. Whereas Facebook explicitly is trying to make the world a more connected place and more open. And open goes with that. And the value of openness, you could argue, sort of even more deeply political, to believe that openness is good. And so you saw that in Facebook. You saw that in a lot of the messaging around Uber. You saw that in a lot of the messaging. WeWork, I think, is a very obvious example where WeWork's messaging was really deeply political. And you saw, I think, with that, a pervasive left-wing aspect to a lot of this messaging. I mean, they would seamlessly mix the direct impact of their product with these sort of broader left-aligned visions around globalization, around multiculturalism, around sort of openness in many other areas. And so it certainly reflected a particular vision. And I think when you're building something new, especially with vast ambitions to change the world, you're sort of inherently coming up with a vision of how the world is going to be organized. And the right really is not present in that world. And that's a problem for two things. One is we're just, in some sense, as conservatives, we haven't really been engaged in those questions of where we should go. Conservatives like to focus on what we want to preserve rather than what we should be creating. So I think it's a temperamental thing. And then I think another one is, so that's a problem. It just leaves them absent. And so in some sense, like, entrepreneurial people by nature are looking for something to aspire to. And if the only people providing that are progressives, are the left, they're probably more likely to sort of default to a leftist vision because they just want to go out and sort of conquer and create something great in some cases. Mm-hmm. Some of them are deeply ideological. Guys like Mark Benioff is deeply ideological. Many of them less so. But I think the other problem is, as a movement, we are at a disadvantage in many ways. Our enemies control almost every institution in society. They have a lot of power. And if you think about a situation like that, then our greatest friend should be disruptive technology. Disruptive technology, more than anything else, should offer us the potential to meaningfully alter that status quo, in some sense, reshuffle the deck in a way that at least gives us a chance of significant gains relative to the status quo. If we're at a significant disadvantage and you're talking sort of ordinary competitive means, you don't see a major reordering. It's going to be fighting an uphill battle in many domains, which is why I think venture is particularly, going to my point, venture is particularly conducive to the right. It is kind of like the space where you can see something emerging and rapidly growing to the point that it actually shifts the balance of power meaningfully.
Well, what does that look like? The shift towards the right? Like on a
I'll throw out one example. As let's say you had a right-aligned Google, and I think leave open the question of whether it would just look like a parallel to Google, and it might not. But at the very least, for the simplest thought experiment, let's say you had a right-aligned Google where think of Google as an inherently values-laden product. By the very nature of the product, you go to the website, you type something, and it gives you a ranked list of results. And that ranked list of results is ranked by some standard of the good. There's a number 1 result, there's number 2 result, number 10. There must be a standard by which it says 1 is better than 2, 2 is better than 10, whatever. That standard that standard is inherently political, or it's inherently values laden, and in many cases can be inherently political. Let's say you had a Google that, in some ways, you could think the people who set the Google algorithm are probably more. That might be a more powerful and impactful policy than what most congressmen could ever hope to actually implement. So deeply powerful, in a sense, sort of powerful governance of the digital layer of our life. And as more and more of our life becomes mediated by algorithms, those who control the digital layer, those who control the networks that are mediating our not just our digital lives, but increasingly that digital layer is mediating decisions we make even offline. It helps decide where I go to eat dinner, for instance. The algorithms there. So it's actually mediating more and more aspects of life. Say you had a Google that was right aligned, you change the algorithm and it elevates good content, objectively good or true content. It elevates content that's conducive toward a common good for society as we understand it. That could radically reshape how people make decisions across many domains of life. It could even change what they believe to be true in important cases. You think of Google News determining what the authoritative source is on some topic. That's tremendously influential, and it could lead to reshaping many other domains of society as well. So in some ways, you could think of something like Google as the pinnacle of a status hierarchy. It sets scores that lots of other companies have to conform to. If you're trying to build a business, just as an example, if you're trying to, let's say, if you're trying to get your content watched by people, how it is treated by the Google algorithm or the YouTube algorithm is going to deeply shape your success, and you're going to be incentivized to essentially conform to the incentives that Google creates. If we control those incentives, then many, many other institutions are going to actually shape their communications and their content to what we elevate and reward. Just like right now, even many conservative institutions essentially conform their content to what Google elevates, which is often perhaps contrary to their mission.
I can see another example being TikTok, where you see it's a Chinese-owned company, and in China, a similar app would be adulating certain behaviors, probably around stabilizing family structures, obedience to the political parties. Whereas in America, you see that it incentivizes a lot of deleterious narcissistic behaviors, right? So it's kind of pushing people in one way in one zone and another way in another zone. So a right-leaning TikTok would boost the trad wives and downrank the gender pronoun people, right?
Exactly. It would boost what we consider good, certainly. It would boost what we consider good as conservatives, as right-wingers, and it would devalue what we consider bad. It would deprecate or suppress what we consider bad. And I think TikTok is in some sense the best because it's one of the most sort of pure play, along with Google, algorithmic apps. So it's impossible to have a values neutral form of TikTok. TikTok is trying to achieve something, even one that's what you often see Silicon Valley do is they don't like to think of their work as political, or they're not comfortable in that domain as much as at the high level. Sometimes they have embraced political values. So they'll focus on sort of engineering type metrics like engagement. Well, even engagement is going to have a particular, you're optimizing for essentially a digital heroin, something that's going to keep you addicted. So that itself is obviously going to have a profound impact on society. And do you push the good or do you push the engaging or the addictive? And those are very different directional questions for where people spend significant time.
Yeah, but isn't that kind of like the marketplace of ideas would, or the marketplace would probably reward for people who are tuning things for engagement over the good, right? So you're already at a disadvantage if you're trying to do both, or you're going to have to be some sort of hypocrite to do like the good heroin. Right,
I'm not sure that's true. Okay. So I'm not sure that needs to be true. First off, I think humans are humans are made to, they have different instincts. Sometimes they like the sort of base engaging, but people want more too. They want ideas that matter. They want truth. It's in our nature. And I think to some extent, especially if it's a people capable of any sort of self-rule, there needs to be an instinct. Like a people who are always going to choose the engaging over the good are, I think, Aristotle would classify them as natural slaves. Yeah, they're natural slaves. They are going to be enslaved by someone. And I think part of the American system of government is predicated on the assumption that at least some subset of people want more than that. So I think first off, there has to be, the market will reward different things. Second off, and this is the big one I think that is often missed, is it can be hard. A low value engagement driven network is also going to it's not going to be conducive to facilitating high trust interactions. So the marketplace might reward it by getting eyeballs for a long time, and eyeballs can be converted with advertisement into sort of consumer-based consumer transactions, but it's not going to facilitate much more. Whereas you imagine a network that's higher value and is more trusted, it might not be as engaging. I might not get quite as many eyeballs for as long, but that platform itself might be able to sell higher value services. Like you might trust that platform. If you see an ad on that platform or it's somehow otherwise monetizing through some sort of matchmaking, you may trust that platform for something you would never trust a low value platform for. And those transactions may be much higher value transactions. So I'm interested in things like hiring and talent placement, or where you could get high value professional services, lawyers. Like you're not likely to hire a lawyer based on an ad on TikTok. It's just it's out of place. It's a service that matters, and you really care about character and quality of the lawyer and their ability to be engaging, or even just their presence on a platform that's centered on sort of addiction and engagement just says very little about their quality. Whereas if it were a network that you trusted, and the example I give is sort of churches, country clubs, some of these, they're networks where there's sort of a lot of trust built in there. And as networks, they're actually able to mediate much higher value transactions. So it's the kind of place where a recommendation can lead to a job, to hiring a high value professional service, sometimes even to a multi-million-dollar investment. And so ultimately, it's a different sort of platform, but and Silicon Valley, by and large, has failed in that space. It's largely failed to facilitate high value transactions and build high trust networks. And I think it goes to the fact that it's a culture that doesn't really understand people, and it doesn't understand, and it doesn't have a very high view of people by and large. You think of Sam Altman, and certainly they believe most people will be replaced by AI, but he even thinks he might be replaced by AI. I mean, it's a group of people with a pessimistic view of human nature, and so it's no surprise that they've optimized for sort of low value consumer applications, and even I would say a lot of enterprise software. I mean, you can think of enterprise software and you can build it in two ways. You can build it to kind of manage people, and I would use Uber as a very good example of this. Uber with the driver is kind of using the driver as the lowest. It's a few engineers design an algorithm that turns around and micromanages millions of people, and they just do the sort of lowest level function that can't be done by a computer until ideally they can replace them with computers. That's one view of software. Software manages the person. The other view is something like Excel. Excel is a tool that does exactly what you want it to do. It's not trying to manage you. You're using it as a piece of leverage to do other things. So you can build software with either of those visions. And if you have a higher view of the person, you're more likely to build. TikTok is sort of extreme in the Uber version, right? TikTok kind of does everything for you, and you're there almost a pure consumer of it. But you can imagine things where you're much more of an agent, and you're using the software as a piece of leverage to accomplish what you want to accomplish. And that's software that's going to tend toward a higher it's going to allow much higher value transactions and interactions.
Going back to what you're talking about Google, like in imagining kind of a right spun Google, Google's prominence is about its globalistic vision, right? It wants to connect everybody, and so it became the connection for everybody. How could a right, what kind of vision could the right or somebody on the right have that is that large, that could facilitate right values on a global level?
So I'm not sure how central the global is the global connection is. I mean, if you think of most of the things you're going to search on Google, most of the time they probably are relatively local, or at least within the US. Certainly there's areas where global scope is going to matter more, but or anglophone scope or whatever. But for a lot of it, I mean, you think of Google Maps, that's inherently local, and yet that's a huge part of sort of Google News. I mean, yes, sometimes you care about global news, but a lot of times it's local. Google Shopping. So I think it may or may not matter. What I would say is, you could imagine. I think the bigger difference I would make with Google versus of sort of global versus local, the differentiating core differentiating component of a right-wing Google would be one that's focused on truth and goodness. So let's say you typed in kids books. You could use Amazon, you could use Google, you type it in. Very good chance you get a bunch of kids books that are going to try to trans your kid, subtly or more overtly these days. There's no standard of goodness there. But let's say you could go to one where you knew that it's almost like the algorithm was catechized with a sense of the good. And you go there and you type whatever you type in, it's actually going to give you results that are good for you, good for your kids. That is going to have an appeal that is increasingly desired, I think, in a world where where social norms break down, and you can no longer sort of trust that the most relevant result, which is largely what Google's going to search for, is actually good. And I would say true is another one. I would say high value on an information standpoint is actually correlated. So Google's a central problem of Google is they don't have the epistemological foundation to distinguish spam from non-spam. If you can't define what is good for people, then you have no ability to say that some sort of information-rich result is better, perhaps, than some sort of AI-generated listicle. Because by what standard is one better than the other? That is a question of value judgment, and they don't know how to think about those values judgments.
So maybe in one way of thinking about things, them dropping their motto, "Don't be evil," wasn't just about them being evil. It's just them not being able to define evil or good.
Exactly. I think that's a perfect way of putting it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, 26, sorry. That one comment just interrupted my head. So the good and the true. So Trump comes along. Trump's an interesting character, right? Because like, what percentage of him is good, true, or beautiful, right? But he's still disrupting, I guess, the political marketplace in favor of the conservatives. Would you say that? Like, he's kind of a problematic character because he can't necessarily be the harbinger of the good, the beautiful, and the true, but he is allowing for the right to have a little bit more traction or to see opportunity where it saw that it was being shut out, right?
So I think conservatives have had a sort of a flawed framework for a long time. Our country's had a flawed framework where they focus on they like to focus on the character of the person, which often leads to perceived character of the person, or even just are they a telegenic person who appears to look good. Instead of what is the agenda that they're fighting for good? Is there a common good? Are they fighting for something? Are they pushing for something that's actually good for the country and good for the people? You can have someone who seems like a very good person who is advancing something that's extremely destructive for the country. You saw a lot of that with the Iraq War, where I think a lot of people who would have been seen as very high character people fought for something. They pushed a war that was disastrous. It was disastrous to Iraq, and it was disastrous for America. And yet by every sort of traditional character standard, they were high character people. Well, maybe our standards of character are flawed if we're only focused on the personal and not the outcome of their policies. I mean, I would also say, in a time of serious crisis, it's someone can have a significant positive impact shaking up the system, and the person willing to do that, going back to distressed investing, the sort of people who get involved in times like that are usually not people who are, they're often sort of from outside of the club, right? They're not people who have all the manners. They're not part of the fraternity. They're often someone who's willing to go and make some hard decisions that need to be made, even if it means offending a lot of people and being rude. And it's kind of like, if the system is inherently headed in a problematic direction, you need someone disagreeable. You need someone willing to do things that are going to get them labeled poorly. So that's going to be seen as, a lot of people will say that is bad character, but a lot of that is just willing to do things that are jarring and that are seen as impolite. I think manners and character are not synonymous. Finally, I think it's people are complicated. I mean, Samson rescued Israel, and the guy was not necessarily a good guy, yet he was the best guy to step up and save Israel. So maybe in times where you need a savior, you take the savior who steps up, not the person who theoretically could be perfect.
Yeah. So taking the analogy from earlier, like if the political framework had been disrupted by Trump, then in another way of thinking things, all these opportunities arise. Where do you think things are now? Or could you walk us through like your point of view on the political shift or realignment, and what opportunities are there to institute, let's say, values that are more right aligned?
So it's a tough question. And I certainly, when it comes to conventional politics, when it comes to the electoral politics, I will not claim any expertise there. I don't think that's a domain where I have huge edge. It's a domain where we face enormous challenges. I think we should be prepared for a range of possibilities. I mean, I guess one point I made is the volatility has been increasing, if you think of this from a financial perspective. So when the Dems arrest Trump, that is a major departure from historical norms. You can think of that as sort of an upping of the pace of departure from previous norms. And even though a lot of those seem to be going in one direction, if you think of markets, if you have bigger and bigger moves in one direction, that's still increasing volatility, which still increases the sort of range of expected outcomes in both directions. You can have either sort of, it's kind of like if stocks are moving more and more aggressively up, you can easily imagine a scenario where they double very rapidly. You can also imagine a scenario where they halve fairly rapidly. And so I think we're in a situation a little bit like that, where the range of outcomes is going up widely, and a stable regime does not intentionally up the volatility like that. That is a regime that is itself in a lot of danger. You can imagine it's easy to imagine a scenario where Trump wins next year. It's easy to imagine a scenario where the Dems respond with extreme violence and just a level of hysteria that would put what we saw in 2017 to shame. So
that's really hard to imagine, but I guess like anything's possible.
Yeah, I guess the point is, I don't know what exactly it looks like. It's hard for me to imagine that, but it's sort of easy for me to envision that is within a range of possibilities that we have to be prepared for. Obviously, the opposite direction is they crush him and they crush Republicans and they start sending us to gulags, and that's also in the range of possibilities. So I think there's a pretty broad range that we need to be prepared for. And you look at sort of world history and you see that the temperature in politics can go up a lot from where it is here. Not just world history, but you look around the world. Yeah. So I would say that being ready for that is significant. Now, I think very clearly we are in a post-constitutional regime without question. We're in a world where, just what the Dems are doing to Trump right now is a perfect example. They are operating well outside of how they go after political prisoners aggressively, how they lawlessly do any number of things, whether effectively execute a coup against Trump. So we're in a post-constitutional regime, and that also just means there's less serious guardrails. Obviously, there sort of continues to be certain aspects of law where a constitution of sorts remains operative, but it's not a system where taking control of Congress can allow us to sort of change the direction of government in ways that would in any way resemble how you might imagine the system works if you read the Constitution and the Federalist Papers.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think another one is, I think the era of the neutral public square is dead. And that, I think, goes actually with, it was sort of a fantasy of the 20th century that you could have a neutral public square. Not something that would have been envisioned in much of human history. And I think the digital actually hammers home the impossibility of that. So going to my point about Google in many ways is one of the central sort of institutions. Companies like that are some of the central institutions of our society, mediating our society, and neutrality is impossible. So once you realize neutrality is impossible in the digital age, you end up in a battle for what values will be the sort of normalized values in society, rather than trying to strip it back to something neutral. And once you realize it's not possible in important domains like search, you're also going to realize it's not really possible, and it just doesn't become a priority in many of the other domains of government as well. And I think it was always a little bit of a fantasy you could maintain that. But I think once people realized that, certainly the left realized that before the right did. The left was pushing AI ethics and all this stuff, algorithmic justice, whatever they call it, very early in the sort of really post-Trump, as they realized that those algorithms helped elect Trump.
Yeah.
And the right has continued to sort of, in many cases, I think, naively fight for neutrality. They say we want this to be neutral. I mean, you hear people sometimes call for something like, we want Google to be treated like a common carrier. Well, it can't be a common carrier if its values laden. Then it's not just like a telephone company that connects you to whoever you dial. And so I think the right is realizing that the new right in many ways is built on the sense that there must be a common good. We're not just going to argue for sort of procedural norms like federalism, the Constitution, or whatever. And so once you realize that both sides are fighting for sharply conflicting visions of the good, that's a different sort of politics, and they're doing so largely outside of, or to a meaningful extent outside of, constitutional norms. And I think that trend will continue.
Okay. Yeah. So how does the right win then? Is it still a democratic project where convincing people, building coalitions and stuff, reaching outside of the party, ameliorating the disaffected leftists, bringing in the classical liberals into the fold? Or is it, doing that intentionally by some sort of evangelical outreach? Or do you think that the values itself will attract, more and more gravitas in the culture?
So I think it's an open question. I think that it may be elements of both. We're not a democracy. We're not a situation where you can persuade people and expect that to result in significant change. I mean, we win the presidency, and the FBI invents scandals to try to take out an elected president. So obviously, electing your president is not going to get you the position to have change. There's millions of federal employees who are protected by civil service protections that are vastly slanted in one direction, and they're going to frustrate the efforts of the right. So, yes, I think that electoral wins will be a component of this. That's certainly something that we need to keep fighting on that front, but that's not going to be enough for victory. I do think a lot of digital and structural could change things. I think that I think we'll see a general breakdown of societal trust broadly, and this is some of what we're working on. Where if you see a breakdown of societal trust, then you could see a sort of collapse of trust in institutions to the point that people look for new. And this is a little bit like going back to the distress concept. I think of high trust aligned communities as reservoirs of trust that have largely been crowded out by institutions and broad digital platforms in terms of commerce and in terms of influence in the world. but they remain, and churches are a great example. You could imagine a world where as broad societal and institutional trust drops, there's suddenly a lot of demand for either you sort of adjust to living in a very low trust society, or you look for alternative mediators and pillars. And maybe these aligned high trust communities could become that. And I think if you combine that with the right digital technology, if you have platforms that help sort of facilitate commerce inside and among people in these aligned communities, and even outside of through these communities to the broader community, then you could imagine a scenario where people suddenly start to look for, as an example, hiring. If you're hiring someone, you could either sort of trust the university degree, and it's almost a formula. You look at the U.S. News and World Report rank of the university, you look at their GPA, you sort of benchmark where they fall, and that's the signal of trust that matters to you. An alternative is you go to a community you're a part of. Let's say you're part of a church. You ask for a recommendation of someone within the church. Those are two competing ways of vetting someone and establishing the threshold needed to take a risky decision, take a risky bet on the person. And as the former degrades in quality, as university degrees, for instance, become less trusted, people may seek more and more through the latter, especially if you then build technologies that make the latter, that make those community-driven networks more convenient, more efficient. Suddenly, you now have a viable alternative, and as you have a viable alternative, you also see people invest more of their energy. I mean, people invest tremendous energy, effectively, in a sort of rat race starting in childhood to get into this university system, huge amounts of wasted effort, which gives the universities huge power. And I would say they're in many ways the sort of pinnacle of opposition to us, pinnacle of power of the left. If people redirect some of that energy to, let's say, to gaining credibility within their own communities, taking jobs in communities that they know are going to lead to good recommendations, that's a sort of reordering of society that has different set of status hierarchies that people are chasing, and that I think could meaningfully shift the balance of power. And it's kind of a collapse of one combined with a growth of the other.
Well, I mean, if there was somebody in your position, because you ended up going to a prestigious law school, right? But because you saw that as a viable way to make your mark in the world or put yourself ahead of everybody else, but you'd be giving up a lot to just like get a humble job in a local, or just move around working your way up in the ladder. How would you pitch that to somebody in your position?
Well, you said, first of all, I think you say it's a humble job in a local thing, but I think that need not be. It was a very sort of clear calculation. What types of jobs could I get coming out of college? What types of jobs could I get with this degree? I think the deal coming out of Harvard has gotten worse in the last 15 years. So for one thing, that's a less attractive option. It's probably more debt. It's probably certainly the career at a law firm is less attractive in many ways. At the same time, a local opportunity need not be, if you have, let's say, churches where there's rich sort of sources of recommendation. Let's say I have the opportunity to take a job as the assistant to the CEO of a local company. I mean, it might be a sort of humble job in certain ways. Maybe it doesn't pay much, but you learn a lot. I would learn a lot. I would have someone where if I impress him, I know that his recommendation can get me a much less humble job. So there's no need there's no sort of inherent reason that the opportunities through local networks need to be less attractive than the opportunities through centralized ones. In many ways, like I subjected myself, and law school is sort of interesting. You sort of score well on one test and you can get into law school. And so it's not really I think it's less of a rat race than many. I mean, HBS, trying to go to HBS would have been more of a rat race, actually. I would have had to sort of subject myself to 3 years at certain types of companies. And then that itself seems like a pretty intolerable. I mean, I think the culture at
HBS being Harvard Business School.
Harvard Business School. Yeah, I think the culture there is actually worse and far woker than the culture was at law school. In many ways, I think business students are some of the most conformist people on the planet. And really there's sort of the level of thinking that you often see there is they think they're good at strategy and they really are sort of good at repeating conventional wisdom. So that would be a unpleasant way to spend time in key ways. But I guess the point is it's a trade-off. And I think that as the opportunities become more attractive through certain communities, through local communities, it better and better competes with the alternatives available. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that can rapidly change. I mean, right now it could be that my best opportunity could come through Twitter, or my kid's best opportunity could come through something like Twitter. And there it's not actually a local community, but it's sort of an aligned community that forms independent of the sort of establishment credential system.
Yeah. You're making me think, going kind of, when we're almost at time, going back to the no enemies to the right, which is a negative statement, and we can define it or not, but what you're kind of hinting at is that mentorships or, pulling people up through the community to establish more cred in your own community rather than outsourcing, outsourcing things to these institutions, outsourcing credentialism to the institutions rather, but bringing it in-house is a way for the alternative community or the non-left aligned communities to grow stronger and to become more independent of the institutions, right? And then also to rob the institutions of talent and of credibility, right?
Exactly. And I think one reason for hope is I think that model is inherently more resilient and even anti-fragile. If you're investing in strong local communities in a world where we see sort of greater and greater global disruptions, you're building something that's less likely to be destroyed. Whereas if you go, let's say you have sort of a very abstracted set of skills and you have a network that's sort of very abstract at the global level, and you've gone away from your family and you're in New York or whatever, and you're doing something there's a lot of, in a world of greater disruption, there's a lot of ways that the deal can change pretty sharply against you. And you don't have a lot of people who necessarily have your back. You don't necessarily have a ton of, you're sort of on your own. And I think we are facing a world where you can expect digital disruption to continue to produce greater and greater disruptions that ripple across society, and sort of a trend toward deglobalization. So there's a real reason to invest in something that's going to be more anti-fragile. And I use anti-fragile as opposed to just resilient because the resilience, yes, you have a local community that you are well invested in, and that protects your downside. That makes you more resilient. But I actually think that if you're part of a core, tight, high trust community, and you've built a career, let's say you've built a brokering career where you're mediating as part of your job, it's actually anti-fragile because if you face broader drops in societal trust, what you have in that community will become scarcer. And as a result, you may have far more people who may have previously, there may be a large number of people who they were sort of on the threshold. It was slightly more attractive for them to go through the sort of broad anonymized institutions. But as those collapse, now they're going to want to go through what you have to offer. They're going to trust you more than they trust those institutions. So you actually are in a position to potentially capitalize on that and sort of rapidly rise as one of the new sort of elite hubs that is mediating a lot of that. So yes, so there's a very strong upside to investing in those high trust communities.
Mm-hmm. So from your own personal point of view, what are the most interesting developments that are the opportunities that you see arising in the political sphere and in a realignment kind of, or even just discursively, like the topics or the people who are starting to give a hopeful vibe or like a opportunity or high potential in developing things that align with your values?
Well, I think one we see is we just see we've seen a rapid growth of high caliber founders coming to us, and we're a venture firm. Fundamentally, New Founding is a venture firm. We invest in companies with a distinct right wing thesis. So they're selling to people on the right. Their product has sort of a clear way that it's solving strategic needs of the right, or maybe it's people on the right are early adopters of a disruptive technology. But we're seeing a growth in really high caliber founders, and that's something that tells you that people are seeing they're willing to cast their lot in this movement in important ways, and
What do you mean
that's
by high quality?
the sort of people you'd bet on. They're doing a project that's very thoughtful. They're doing something that they're the sort of people you would back. I mean, maybe to some extent it's just more. They're willing to invest their effort in something that is that is serving people in this space, and that is they're willing to signal that publicly. So that's a big. That's that. I mean, ultimately, as a venture investor, you're betting on people. So the caliber of the people, their capability is one of the most important things that determines whether you're going to back them. The idea is worth something, but they're going to iterate on the idea. They'll figure it out. But are they someone who really knows that? Do they understand? Are they able to really figure out what the problem is and what the right solution is with the right iteration? So that's a huge one. I think another one is this this willingness to have adult level conversations about ideas that are outside of the traditional entertainment. And this goes to the no enemies to the right concept. I mean, we can have a conversation about that. That's a very practical sort of realpolitik conversation. And I think enough people observe principles like that very serious people can have conversations about things that would be seen as sort of beyond the pale to Republicans 10 years ago. And that goes to maybe the post-constitutional state. The right was long handicapped by its inability to even entertain ideas that fell outside of its sort of ideals that it was captivated to, which really made it a slave of the left in many ways. And that was a handicap, and that's no longer true. So that opens the range of possibilities. I mean, that doesn't mean anything in particular. It's not clear what in particular is going to win there, but it opens the range of possibilities, and it makes a much more vibrant place for discussion and debate, and for, I think, the right sort of political. I think there's huge opportunity for the right political entrepreneur to rise very quickly. Sort of like I view Trump as a political entrepreneur. He took a position that was outside of the mainstream for his party and leveraged some personal virtues. Use that virtue in the Machiavellian sense there, but leveraged sort of a capability in important ways to rapidly rise to reshape the political landscape. And he's not going to be the last. I think we're in a space where there's incredible opportunity for someone with the right vision and the right talents to do something analogous to that.
Is there either a person or a work or a book that over the years has really influenced you, that you keep returning to, or that keeps popping up in you in terms of guidance or orientation?
So there's a few, and one that I like that really shapes how I think about the nature of trust, and has really influenced how I think about a lot of what I work on in business, particularly, is Knowledge and Power by George Gilder. And he really talks about it's sort of a reframing of economics in a way that recognizes human agency and human creation as central to it, the creation of information. And I think that applies likewise to what a non-technocratic, bureaucratic approach to business is going to look like. It's approach to business where we really value human judgment, whereas so much of business is about squeezing out human judgment in favor of bureaucratic or analytical processes. So that one is interesting. And then I think another one, and it really emphasizes the concept of skin in the game as central to information. It's kind of like human judgment. If you think about it, human judgment plays a central role in that. You could think of one of the highest information decisions is an investment bet. You're betting on something that if it's just an opinion that you write on an internet forum as an anon, it's irrelevant. There's no information value in some anonymous vision, in some anonymous person's opinion about a stock. Whereas that same opinion, if it's by someone who's willing to stake tens of millions of dollars behind it, there's enormous skin in the game, and that can be something that can really drive major change. So I think that skin in the game and you would look at that as another investor and say, okay, that person believes in this. I'm now going to take that seriously too. It's now a bet that matters. And I think skin in the game determines to a great extent whether you can trust something that goes, obviously, if you can sort of follow the analysis very clearly, and if it's all sort of provable on a spreadsheet, you don't necessarily need that. Actually, you can just look at the analysis. It makes sense. You could do it. But that model of economics and investing converges toward things like buying apartment buildings. I mean, apartment building will always pencil out better than anything else in some sense, because there's not really a lot of sort of judgment or risk. Whereas a venture bet on a person, by its very nature, includes some leaps that are really kind of hard to justify by numbers on a spreadsheet. And so skin in the game, knowing the person's track record, knowing that they're staking some of their own reputation, and it's a substantial reputation, is central to evaluating the significance and essentially the information value of such bets. So that's one. And related to that is Anti-Fragile by Taleb, and a lot of Taleb's thinking generally relates to a lot of concepts around skin in the game, really as a sort of substitute for the analytical expert framework for getting to truth, which dominates our society today. And related to that is Taleb's idea of how a minority of people can have an intolerant minority can have significant impact and can have a lot of change. And I think that influences a lot. I think in a world where a lot of people are effectively NPCs, they're going to watch what the TikTok algorithm shows them. Yeah. You don't need to, it's not about persuading a majority of people first and foremost. It's first and foremost about a minority doing something that drives change in creates an alternative vision or drives change in a meaningful direction. And if anything, you create the next TikTok, let's say, that in turn can then influence tens of millions of people potentially, but it's not the influencing of the people that's ultimately the significant challenge. It's building something great, building something successful.
Yeah. So any projects coming up or public speaking gigs or any ways for people to follow you or contact you or just follow what you're doing or where you're headed?
So Twitter, active on Twitter, Nate A. Fischer on Twitter. And I spent a lot of time intentionally there because going to the point about, from a media perspective, our being public in a world where many people aren't public with these viewpoints in business, our being public about them allows a lot of people to come to us, and then we can then broker a lot of transactions that couldn't otherwise happen, where politics matters deeply. We have a fund. You can go to our website, newfounding.com. We have an AngelList rolling fund that we're actively investing right now. We're looking for startups that fit our thesis. Really early stage at this point. It's mostly pre-seed and seed. And we'll lead or we'll participate in deals, again, that fit that model. We're also raising. So you can go find information about the fund there. And I think there's an exciting macro thesis behind this type of investing. And so we're seeing, as I said, compounding deal flow from high quality founders. And so it's a good way to get involved. It's a good way to get economically involved in it. And then really we just want to hear from people who are doing interesting things in terms of I'm regularly talking to people on podcasts. The New Founding podcast is by two guys on my team, Santiago Pliego and Josh Clemens, and they've had a really interesting series of guests. So see what's happening in this broad space. So different, kind of depending on where you're coming from and what you're doing, there's a lot of different ways to get involved. And then talent placement. I mean, a big one is we have become a hub for people as well as opportunities. And so you can go there and we have a network of people looking for opportunities. Our motto is build the America you want to live in. And you can do that by starting a company. You can do that by investing in companies that are building what you want to live in. You can also jump into the network and sign up and create a profile and see opportunities from other companies that are doing something that you get excited to get up and do every morning.
Excellent. Nate, thanks so much for your time. It's really hopeful to see people who are engaging in a proactive way. It can be really easy to just be a critic or a culture critic or a curmudgeon online, especially in political spaces and political debates. But you're part of people who are putting their money where their mouth is, quite literally. So it's great to to give air to that, because there's actually activity going on to follow through on this potential rather than just kind of decry the downfall of the West, right?
It's exciting. It's why I'm doing what I'm doing. Is I think there's real potential to build something that changes the direction.
No. Are you running for office, or are you keeping that under wraps? Is that no?
I am in business because I believe that business is certainly where my talents are best suited,
No.
And it's also where I believe there's actually the most potential for impact at this point.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.